So I made a video about narrative design in The Last of Us earlier this year, and this is kind of a corollary to that. Since I've talked about the past and current state of storytelling in games, I feel like it's worth taking a look at the future too. Now, games don't necessarily need to have a story, or at least an overt one. Most of the early games didn't, and many modern games don't, and they do just fine. And that's a good place to start, actually, because of all the best-selling games ever, very few of them actually have explicit stories that have interesting characters and engaging themes. Instead, they focus on crafting fun gameplay that's easy to understand and control. The stories this gameplay creates make up the story of the player's experience. So why do we even need stories in games, then? It looks like we've been doing just fine without them. Well, to me, the most powerful thing a piece of art can do is make you feel something. And games have a greater potential to do so because they give you the agency to make choices, leaving you to wrestle with those decisions. And multiplayer games do this inherently through systems which promote social interaction. Single-player games have a much tougher time with this, leaving them to rely on tropes and methods from other mediums, primarily movies and television. Whether due to a lack of vision, technology, time, or a combination of all these factors, games in the last decade have largely stagnated in how they let the player interact with their narratives. In other words, they mostly don't. Enter Ken Levine.
Movies don't give a crap about you. Games do.
If you don't know him, Ken is a guy who tried his luck in Hollywood writing screenplays before moving into game development. He worked on a few very influential games in the 90s, like the original Thief, and he directed System Shock 2. If you do know him, you know that he also created the Bioshock franchise. Levine directed and wrote the original Bioshock, as well as Bioshock Infinite, two games that were widely praised for their use of integrating mature topics like political and cultural issues into their stories. These games, and Levine himself, are particularly notable because very few other series or directors have approached topics like these in the decades since Infinite. And while shooting for mass appeal and avoiding controversy are perfectly good excuses, this makes many games appear to lack a distinct artistic vision or human element and only serve to maximize profits. One thing that games did take from Bioshock, though, was a mechanic for delivering narrative. Audio logs were popularized by the original game and serve as a way to give a player deeper insight into a game's world while they're continuing to interact with it. And this interaction aspect is the key, along with them being relatively cheap for devs to implement, of course. I'll save my cutscene rant for another day, but being able to deliver story and gameplay at the same time is one of the markers for a great game in my eyes. Which makes it kind of funny that Levine's last game, Bioshock Infinite, released in the same year as two massive games from studios that rely on the exact opposite approach. Now if you don't know, that year is 2013, and while we know how The Last of Us 2 turned out, and GTA 6 is coming in a few years, there's still no word on a release date for Levine's next game, Judas. Announced at the Game Awards in 2022, Judas was surprising and unsurprising all at once. Levine's been working on this project for much of the past decade at Ghost Story Games, a small studio he founded after leaving Irrational, where Bioshock was developed. And many fans eagerly anticipated what project would come out of the studio, not only because of Levine's track record, but also because Irrational was quickly shuttered after his departure, leaving us in a Bioshockless world where few games were pushing narrative boundaries. What was revealed was a single-player, narrative, first-person shooter set in a sci-fi universe. Sound familiar? While Judas looks oddly similar to his past work, I'm still particularly intrigued by it because of the potential of the ideas Levine laid out in a GDC talk back in 2014. These concepts as a collective form the design philosophy for at least the beginning of the development of the game. Please go watch this talk. I'll give you a few seconds to pause and come back before I keep going. Oh, you're not going to watch it, are you? Okay, well, I can sum it up in an abridged version. Narrative Lego, second only in catchy design names to the Nemesis system, is a collection of game systems which in theory give the player more agency over the stories in a game, while providing developers with reusable assets to create larger amounts of potentially evergreen content more quickly. Even abridged, it's kind of a mouthful. Certain characters in this game, that Levine calls stars, have several preferences or micro-passions, which players can impact through their actions. These micro-passions would feed into an overall macro-passion, which determines how the star feels about the player. Drones, or generic guards and citizens, would have a macro-passion as well, that's determined by the macro-passions of local stars. Macro-passions would have multiple thresholds in a positive and negative direction from their starting point. Meeting these thresholds would trigger appropriate dialogue and animations to convey how the character's feelings about the player have changed. They would also impose penalties or provide benefits to the player, as well as potentially reveal new hidden passions. Causing multiple stars to approve or disapprove of the player can act as triggers for major events, which can add new passions to stars. Stars and their passions would be positioned in opposition to each other in such a way to create zero-sum games. Now, that's a lot to get a handle on, so let's break down Ken's logic a little bit. At a high level, stars and passions build a web of interwoven relationship states that can be altered by the player's actions and crafted content. The stars and their passions would be limited to a small number so that players wouldn't get overwhelmed from juggling the relationship web of an entire town, and developers wouldn't have to crunch for years to make it. Players would have to consider mechanical rewards like extra content or shop discounts, as well as attachment to individual stars as characters in the narrative. The zero-sum game aspect forces players to make difficult decisions, as they can't become friends with benefits with everyone. All of these elements are non-linear, interact with each other, and trigger off player actions that are generally transparent to the player. It all makes me think of Ken's past games and the systemic nature of immersive sims, like how you could get to the other side of a door in half a dozen different ways in the best games in the genre. What if there were a multitude of ways to influence a game's narrative? Sure, plenty of games have had branching narratives, but they rely heavily on dialogue choices as the primary way in which they allow players to impact the story. Could a story be driven and connected through gameplay systems as dynamically as the mechanics in immersive sims are? You can point to several aspects of narrative Lego that feel common, especially to RPGs and dating sims, but it's the potential for them all interacting with each other at a large scale according to the player's actions that make the framework so interesting to me. The most similar system in a game I've played is Fallout New Vegas' reputation system that impacted companions, towns, and factions. Even still, those pieces don't all connect and talk with each other at as systemic a level as Levine proposes here. I said earlier that single-player games often rely on forms of narrative interaction that are commonly found in movies and television, and while that's typically the case in games with explicit stories, one type of game succeeds consistently in letting players mold their own story. Grand strategy games are largely played in a single-player mode, as you can tell by looking at any of their online game browsers. They also happen to rarely have linear, main stories, and instead, players typically choose a starting faction and are placed in a set or randomized location against other factions that are also set or randomized, and their interactions with these factions make up the story of any given game. The grandfather of the genre uses randomization to enhance replayability, and is cited by Levine as an inspiration for narrative Lego. In a typical game of Civilization, the geography of the map and civilizations within it are randomized. As players explore and start to clear away the fog of war, their terrain and competitors are revealed at the same time. Civilizations have hidden tendencies and preferences, like being more expansionist or friendly with city-states. They can also be manipulated by the player's actions through a diplomacy-based opinion system that works similar to companion relationship systems from RPGs. Declaring multiple wars will make civs weary, while starting up trade deals can get them on your side. How players react and adapt to this information creates the story of the game, and can be highly variable to the point that you never play a similar game twice. This is before you even consider all the different settings that players can use to modify their experience. On top of the typical difficulty choice, players can choose which civs appear, how many there are, the speed of the game, the frequency of terrain features during generation, and many, many more variables. As you can see, with a multitude of randomization and customization options, Civ can be tailored to any desires a player has on a given day. Which begs the question, can other games be built like this? Sure, custom modes in multiplayer games offer lots of customization, and many single-player games have been at the forefront of accessibility in recent years, but these features have little impact on the story that a game tries to tell. Being a big fan of the Civilization series himself, Levine considers this very thing, talking about not only being able to support different stars in a new playthrough, but also being able to have their passions randomized like the map in a game of Civ. The set number of stars could be modified as well, or the player could choose specific ones, like how civilizations function. This could provide a framework for players to customize the story of their game in a way that's never been possible in a game before, and it would allow for additional stars, passions, and quests to be added into the main game itself after release, instead of onto its periphery like how most DLC or post-launch content functions currently. I also wonder about the potential for large language models, or what's been commonly referred to as AI. Although these models are magnitudes closer to a Google search bar than actual general intelligence at the moment, it's only a matter of time before they get significant upgrades. In a game that utilizes narrative Lego, LLMs could potentially be used to support writers in building out dialogue for stars and drones. Imagine, as an example, a writer giving templates to a model that consists of dialogue that's said by various stars at certain thresholds to train it. Once the model has enough data to draw from, it could provide additional threshold dialogue for various other stars and even drones as well. This would be a similar application to their use in games coming out today that supplement announcer and bark dialogue. There's even full-on simulated dungeon masters that can run your tabletop game for you. Now, I'm not necessarily condoning the use of the technology in this instance, but I want to point out that the use cases here are applicable and very real possibilities as LLMs become more advanced in the future. Since Valve reinvented how video games could tell stories back in 1998 with Half-Life, many games have adopted environmental storytelling. One critical game being Bioshock, which used it to tell the story of Rapture's downfall, even though the player arrives after it happened. Bioshock also popularized the use of audio logs to tell game stories and showed players that serious topics could be explored in games. Fallout New Vegas explored several of these heavier topics in a world of branching choices, environmental stories, and modern gameplay following its lineage from the CRPGs of the 90s. And Shadow of Mordor gave us the Nemesis system, an integration of gameplay and narrative so engaging that it basically sold the game on its own merit. All of that is to say that video game storytelling has changed over time, but it's been treading the same ground for a good while, and I have a feeling that narrative Lego could be the next step. Whatever you think of Ken Levine's games, it can't be denied that he's helped shape some of the most interesting narratives, villains, and settings in the history of the industry. And no developer that I know of has ever laid all their cards out on a table in a public forum a decade before they release their next game. It's this combination of experience, confidence, and willingness to take feedback that makes me think we might be in for something really special with Judas. I don't know how many Legos Levine and his team can fit into it, but I can't wait to find out.
The heart of that is something that's central to our game, which is recognizing the player's presence in the world, because that's why we play games, right? We play games so we can have an impact on the world. That's what it's the difference between games and movies, right? If you could probably define it in one sentence, there's a million other differences. Movies don't give a crap about you. Games do. And we want to keep pushing on that and heighten that. That's one of our central tenets.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.